and welcome to the Literature Café. So there are very few philosophers who polarize as strongly as Friedrich Nietzsche. So for some, he's the bold free spirit to question everything, even calling for a complete revaluation of all values. But for others, he's a very dangerous provocateur, someone whose statements like calling humans herd animals, declaring God is dead, or claiming that morality is merely tool of the weak sound less like philosophy and more like the ravings of a madman. But that raises the question, like, how did Nietzsche even come up with all these provocative ideas in the first place? Things like the master-slave morality or his infamous concept of the overman. And honestly, I've got to say, Nietzsche really isn't exactly easy to wrap your head around. But what I can tell you is, if you really want to understand Nietzsche, you can't just fixate on these individual quotes or these isolated ideas. You have to take Nietzsche as a whole, and the only real way to do this is to go back to the beginning, to the very roots of his thinking, and that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're going all the way back to his very first work. The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music. So Nietzsche explicitly dedicated this work to Richard Wagner, who without a doubt had a major influence on both his writing and also his whole philosophy. And now Nietzsche had already been deeply fascinated by music since he was a child. He even composed music himself. But the real turning point came during his university years when he was studying theology and classical philology. And that's when he heard Wagner's music. And he was instantly overwhelmed, completely taken it by the sheer power of it. And for Nietzsche, Wagner seemed like the first pioneer of a whole new artistic and philosophical era. Because what Wagner brought back into focus was the Dionysian, the wild, ecstatic, the life-affirming force, which for Nietzsche stood in stark contrast to the pure reason and intellectualism. So in Nietzsche's eyes, it was really Wagner who made the connection between music and the pessimistic philosophy of Schopenhauer. So Schopenhauer believed that the world, if it can be endured at all, can only be endured through an aesthetic lens, so through art. But what exactly did Wagner show Nietzsche? So Nietzsche actually gives us an answer to that in The Birth of Tragedy, because it's here that he first lays out this key tension between the Dionysian and the Apollinian. So something he believed not only shaped Greek art, but deeply influenced the entire development of Western culture. Because according to Nietzsche, we humans, just like the heroes of classical tragedy, are caught in a lifelong struggle between these two primal forces, symbolized by the gods Apollo and Dionysus. There are two conditions in which art appears in man like a force of nature, as a compulsion to have visions and as a compulsion to an orgiastic state. Now when we talk about Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstatic frenzy, we associate him with everything wild, overflowing and unrestrained, and he stands for the ecstatic, the sensual, the warlike force that bursts forth when boundaries are broken. So there's a lot of vitality in that instinct and even a kind of primal, untamed energy. And then on the other side, you've got the Apollonia, named after Apollo, which stands for clarity, form, and order. And it's the force that structures things, that separates and arranges, bringing in a sense of harmony and also proportion. And in a tragedy, the hero is often trying to make sense of all the painful struggles and chaotic events of life, so trying to find some peace or order. But then his Dionysian side keeps shaking things up, keeps making that order dance, so to speak, and that shows us something crucial. that human nature is fundamentally torn. On one hand, we strive to overcome, to transcend, and on the other, we inevitably get caught up in limits and structure. See, the Dionysian is all about breaking through the usual boundaries. It's this intense state of being fully alive, where you forget every worries. But that kind of height is often followed by a kind of emptiness, sometimes even disgust and existential paralysis, when the impermanence or the seeming meaninglessness of life suddenly hits you. And that's exactly why art is so important for Nietzsche. Art helps us to get past that paralysis, that disgust, and it can bring us back to a heightened sensitivity, even enthusiasm. Like when you are watching a tragedy, you forget your daily frustrations and you experience this deep shared emotional moment that feels both elevating and freeing. And these two forces, the Dionysian and Apollonian, they are not just abstract opposites, they are more like two sides of the same creative power, and they actually need each other to make something truly alive. And Nietzsche is clear about this, that these two principles aren't enemies. They have to work together to culture for culture and art to really thrive, because it's only where there's structure and restraint that access and intensity can break through in a meaningful way. And for Nietzsche, the Dionysian and the Apollonian are deeply interconnected. You can really see this in Aeschylus. His plays are a perfect example of this intense interplay between these both forces. So the Dionysian element comes through the chorus, while the Apollonian shows up mostly in the action unfolding on the stage. And that way the audience gets the full spectrum of human experience. Joy, suffering, contradiction, chaos, because all of it belongs to life. And in that process, the human being doesn't just become an artist, they become a work of art themselves. Singing and dancing, man expresses himself as a member of a higher community. He has forgotten how to walk and talk, and is about to fly dancing into the heavens. His gestures express enchantment, just as the animals now speak, and the earth yields up milk and honey. He now gives voice to supernatural sounds. He feels like a god. He himself now walks about in raptures and elated as he saw the gods walk in dreams. Man is no longer an artist. He has become a work of art. The decline of tragedy. But Nietzsche argues that this balanced form of art meets a tragic end with the arrival of the philosopher Socrates, because his cold rationality for Nietzsche marks the beginning of a cultural decline, because now a new kind of human being steps onto the stage, the theoretical type of person. Happiness now only means you have to imitate Socrates and establish a permanent state of daylight against all dark desires, the daylight of reason. Any concession to the instincts, to the unconscious, leads downwards. And what that means is, with Socrates and later Plato, a new era begins, one that starts to question everything, psychologize everything, and treats reason as the one and only path to the good, the true, and the beautiful. Tragedy, especially in the hands of Euripides, who was heavily influenced by Socratic thinking, was now forced to obey reason, and ideas like know thyself or the highest virtuous wisdom were suddenly made the ultimate measure of all things. Plato then takes it further. The true world, he claims, is now the realm of pure ideas. The body's desires, our sensory experience, all that Dionysian energy, it's reduced to a mere shadow, a deception, something dark that pulls us downward. And from then on, this opposition between the lower physical world and the higher intellectual one runs right through art and literature. But for Nietzsche, this marks a major shift in Europe's cultural form, from an original symbolic aesthetic consciousness to a kind of spirit-focused objectification of life. And sure, Socrates admitted that we lack true knowledge, but he still placed this awareness of ignorance as the highest form of human capacity. And from that point on, anything that came from rational thought or logical analysis was considered morally good, and anything driven by instinct, feelings, or intuition was condemned as wrong or dangerous. And that led to a deep hostility towards art as well. Even tragedy itself came to be seen as dangerous because it was supposedly lured people into illusion and failed to deliver that kind of higher understanding. And it's in this play, science and rational thinking were raised up as the new saviors, as tool to solve everything, to get to the root of being also. But Nietzsche flat out rejected this moral hierarchy that elevates abstract reason while devaluating the physical and the instinctual and the sensual. For him, this scientific optimism wasn't progress, it was the start of decay, the beginning of a deep hatred for life, because the cost of this rationality was alienation from our instincts and from the raw power of life itself. And that's exactly what Nietzsche also means when he talks about hostility to the body. He holds firm throughout his life to the view that suffering is not some divine punishment or moral failure. It's just part of life's inherent tragedy, something we have to accept as part of being human, because suffering, chaos, darkness, you can't just reason them away. You can't analyze them out of existence. And trying to do so strips the individual of something essential. A deeply human experience, because what's left is a fake world made of arguments, proofs, and theories. And to bring it down to earth for a second, so everything we see today in terms of rationality, order, morality, or logical consequences in everyday life, that's all the Apollonian at work. And sure, we value that clarity. But Nietzsche hits hard on the fact that in the process we are forgetting a huge part of ourselves, those raw primal forces that keep pushing back against order, that wild energy, their irrationality, that they are constantly being repressed by the Apollonian. And this is where Nietzsche draws heavily from Schopenhauer, and we can already see the overlap with what Freud would later develop. And all of them, in different ways, recognize that life itself is rooted in the dark, the unconscious, and the irrational. And Nietzsche, especially in his later work, makes it clear that these instincts we're no longer allowed to express don't just disappear. No, they turn inward. And that's where Nietzsche introduces the idea of bad conscious, which for Freud becomes the unconscious, the part of the mind where repressed drives can return in more harmful forms. And many of Nietzsche's ideas, like his fierce critiques of Christianity or morality, connect back to this glorification of the Dionysian, of ecstatic experience and raw vitality. But unlike Schopenhauer, Nietzsche didn't see the will as some dark, blind force that condemns us to suffering. He wasn't life-denying, like quite the opposite. He was radically life-affirming, and that shift becomes especially clear in his later writings, where he embraces this will and it urges us to live creatively rather than falling into Schopenhauer's pessimisms. And that's also why Nietzsche saw hope in Wagner's music. He thought maybe through this kind of art we could awaken the suppressed Dionysian again, bring it back to life, and finally break free from the grip of cold rationalism. My friends, you who believe in Dionysian music, you also know what tragedy means to us. In it, reborn from music, we have tragic myth. And in that myth, you may hope for everything and forget all that is most painful. But the most painful thing for us all is the long degradation under which the German spirit, far from house and home, lived in the service of vacant dwarfs. You understand my words, as you will also in the end understand my hopes. And so Nietzsche continued to see music as the most primal, the most powerful of all arts, because nowhere else can the Dionysian and its containment by the Apollonian be experienced so immediately, so viscerally. And what Nietzsche really wanted was for ecstatic tragedy, that intense vital force at the heart of life itself, to return to our increasingly rational, theoretically disenchanted world. Because if our entire modern culture were ruled by nothing but abstract Socratic wisdom, Nietzsche says that would be nothing short of an educational spasm, a kind of cultural cramp. And it's through this deep connection to music, which once went thread through all his work, that he writes in such a vivid, almost poetic language with so much emotional intensity. And that's also what gives us that famous Nietzsche sound. So a tone that stands out clearly from the dry, rigid prose of typical academic philosophy. And sure, the book has its weaknesses. So at times it's full of rhapsodic outbursts. So also some ideas kind of feel unpolished and makes it quite difficult to read. He also refuses to give us clear-cut philosophical arguments. Instead, he offers these more emotional confessions. And of course, his academic peers weren't thrilled by that at all. His unsystematic, unscientific approach didn't exactly make him popular in philosophical circles, but probably that was the point of Nietzsche, that he wanted to reject the whole formal Socratic way of doing philosophy, even in his style of writing. And in doing so, he also managed to do something truly unique, I think, that he found a way to make thinking at least feel like music. And that was Friedrich Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you next time here at the Literature Café.